I will, in this session, be talking about race and ethnicity. I know somebody raised that question earlier, and I think it is fundamental to what we want to talk about here, and especially if we're going to link poverty and inequality, upward mobility to patterns of residential segregation and where people actually live. Do I just touch the button on this? So let me acknowledge, first of all, my co-authors, Mimo Parisi, who's in the back. He'll come up later. He's at Mississippi State. And Helga de Valk, who's a sociologist at the University of Brussels. She's also at the Netherlands Interdisciplinary Demographic Institute in The Hague. And you'll see why she's on the paper in a bit when we talk about some of the European cities. So we're going to talk about segregation today, and I want to tie it to immigration and assimilation. You know, it's trite but true. The United States is a land of immigrants. About 1 million individuals every year are coming to the United States as legal permanent immigrants. 40 million people in the United States are foreign-born. And of course, one of the big concerns, or one of the big issues, even in this political campaign this year, is about immigration and racial diversity and Black Lives Matter and so on. And immigration is fueling that racial diversity, and you know, if you believe the Census Bureau's projections, by the year 2043, the majority of Americans will be something other than non-Hispanic white. Now, what's interesting, I think, is not only this assimilation question, to what extent different racial and ethnic groups, immigrants, share the same social and residential space as the native-born white population, but these issues also, I think, are important in Europe, especially today, when we see unprecedented levels of immigration across the European Union, where we see large refugee populations that have come into Europe. We see that now with the situation in Syria, into Germany and other parts of Europe. And the question that they have is to what extent they will be assimilated. And one of the things that we want to do, focus on here, is this comparative element, looking at integration, spatial integration in Europe with some of the new immigrant gateways and emerging gateways in the United States. And oftentimes, I was in Europe a couple years ago and spent 7 months there, and one of the issues is always they look to the United States, believe it or not, for lessons about how to deal with the immigration and integration issue, because they're less successful in many ways of integrating people who are non-citizens. So today what I want to do is I want to talk about three things. First of all, I want to provide some background about patterns of residential segregation in the United States and Europe during this period of massive immigration on both sides of the Atlantic. And I want to distinguish between what we refer to as macro segregation and micro segregation. Most of the work that's been done on segregation has focused on cities and neighborhood segregation within cities. The concentration of African Americans or Hispanics or new immigrant groups into particular neighborhoods within cities, and how there's variation from one city to the next in the extent of that segregation. So in the United States, the average level of segregation for African Americans is about 60, which means about 60% of African Americans would have to move somewhere else in the city in order to be distributed in the same shares across all city neighborhoods. When we talk about macro segregation, on the other hand, we're talking about the larger spatial redistribution of different racial and ethnic minorities. There's a caucus tonight, as you all know, or some of you know, in Iowa, and the overwhelming share of African Americans in Iowa is in Polk County in Des Moines. They're not out there in Storm Lake, Iowa. You know, they're not in some of the rural villages in Iowa. That's a different kind of segregation. It's a broader level of segregation. And so we're going to talk about both the macro segregation, the distribution of racial and ethnic groups across the United States, but we're also going to talk about the distribution of different kind of groups across the European Union, across different parts of the European Union. And then lastly, because we don't have all the countries, this is just a project that's in progress, I also want to show how the United States compares with a whole list of other case studies of different cities in the European Union, and where in particular blacks, Hispanics, and Asians fit into the international scene. Why does segregation matter? I think one thing, as I've already mentioned, we've spent a lot of time talking about income inequality and so on. Many people think it measures social distance between different population groups to the extent that people live together, they share the same social space. And the reason they share the same social space, they live in the same place, is because they're similar in a lot of different characteristics. So it's a proxy for social distance in some ways. It's also a measure of assimilation or integration because social and spatial mobility oftentimes go hand in hand. In the United States, it's always been the case that part of the American dream was this movement from big city ethnic neighborhoods or poor working class neighborhoods to the suburbs where you could get better housing, safer environment, and so on. So spatial and social mobility always go hand in hand, and I think that's why this is important. And then lastly, I think, as many of you know, segregation is associated with access to society's rewards. That is, whether we have access to a good job, whether we have access to a safe neighborhood, whether our kids can go to good schools, and so on. And all of these things, I think, make segregation an especially important part of America's, in the European case too, social stratification system. So what might be different in terms of racial and ethnic segregation in Europe and the United States? I've got a few things here. I don't want to go through all of these, but there are differences, as we've seen today, in poverty, the welfare safety net. We might expect in the United States in a more market-driven kind of housing market where people purchase their neighborhoods, they purchase their communities in some sense. Where there's greater inequality, we would expect there to be greater residential inequality in the United States. We have different systems of public transportation. We have different social housing policies or public housing policies. There are differences in the funding formulas for schools. In the United States, we fund our schools at the local and state level as opposed to a national centralized system. What does that mean? Well, as a motivation for moving into particular kinds of neighborhoods, that's going to be less the case of differential funding in some schools that might attract some parents here than in other parts of Europe. We emphasize private housing markets, as I've mentioned. There's also differences in discrimination, perhaps associated with a threat, a minority group that are associated with much larger immigrant and racial minority populations. And that's the case in the United States. As I said, we expect to have a case where 50% of Americans by the year 2043 will be something other than non-Hispanic white, but it's already unfolding unevenly across geographic space in the United States. The majority of the nation's biggest cities in the United States are already majority minority. So this is unfolding differently across space and may suggest a different threat across space as well to the native-born white population. The way we're going to look at this is to use the workhorse of segregation, and that is the index of dissimilarity. The index of dissimilarity just says what percentage of the minority population would have to move elsewhere in order to achieve racial parity. I gave the example a moment ago of Polk County, Iowa. That means you'd have to move African Americans from Polk County, Iowa to other parts of the state in order to achieve the same percentage of African Americans at the state level into every single county or area of the state. These things range from 0 with no segregation, you wouldn't have to move anybody, to you'd have to move everybody 100%. And I already gave you the example of the average level of segregation between blacks and whites in the United States, which is extraordinarily high for the nation's largest cities, 60. Some cautionary notes in making these comparisons. Well, first of all, the first caution is you really can't do this well. And you can't do it well because there are differences in the availability of data by ethnicity or race, certainly not available as part of the Eurostat in Europe. And so what we've tried to do is try to identify a couple really salient features of minority status in the United States. That tends to be race and ethnicity. And in Europe today, I think it tends to be ethnicity, or not ethnicity, it tends to be immigration or citizen status. And that's what we're going to do here. There's basically going to be a distinction or segregation between the other and everybody else. The other part of this is that the scale matters, and we don't have perfect comparisons between the scale of geography, either at the micro level or at the macro level, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we're really talking about what does define a labor market in the United States and Europe, or between different European countries, and then what is the scale of that neighborhood when you start looking at micro-segregation. So let me just start out with the macro segregation, the big picture of the way different racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, citizens are distributed across the geographic space. And this is what the map looks like for the United States in the year 2010. And all we've done is we've taken the percent non-white, the percent non-white, and we're identifying those, we're taking the average percent non-white across all 3,100 counties, and we're identifying in the darkest orange color here those that exceed that. We have a middle range, and then we have those who are the least diverse. So you can see the whole Black Belt Crescent. You can see parts of the Southwest. You can see Indian reservations in the Dakotas. You can see the Chicago metropolitan area and so on, and you can see Iowa, okay? And there's Polk County right there in the middle, which is the diverse place. So you can see the spread here. Here's what it looks like in the European Union on the basis of citizenship status. We have a different scale here, but again, it shows you, first and foremost, I think, this spread from the south to the north, in part associated with labor mobility. It also suggests the movement from former colony states that have moved into the Paris region or other parts of Europe, London, and so on, or into the Netherlands. But you can see the broad scale. So what does this mean in terms of the segregation index that I mentioned before? And I'll just show you what some of these look like. So the overall average, I think, is quite surprising. That first column there is the U.S. white, non-white average, which is 40.2, which says about 40% of non-whites in the United States would have to move to other counties in the United States in order for whites and non-whites to be distributed in the same proportions across counties. And then right adjacent to it, I have the U.S. white-black distribution, which is slightly higher. So blacks are slightly more segregated on the macro level from whites. It's 47. And then you can see the European comparison, the next two columns there, which are really quite remarkably similar to what we see in the United States. Now, we've gone through in the report, and we hardly say anything about it in the text, and you can look at the very detailed tables for different groups. But here we've got the European citizen, non-citizen distribution, but we also have the European African non-citizen comparison, and that African non-citizen comparison is quite similar to what we see in the United States for whites and blacks, that it's about 50 here as opposed to 47. So again, you see that color matters, national origin matters, and it shows up in these broad-scale distributions of groups by race. And again, I want to emphasize the macro segregation in part because most of the studies that have been done have focused on cities at a time when population is distributing outward. And the best case of this is in the case of Hispanics, which were overwhelmingly concentrated in the Southwest of the United States, and that was an issue for the Southwest. And what's happened over the last 20 years is you've seen this spreading out of Hispanics throughout the United States, where almost every part of the United States has experienced massive in-migration of immigrants, of Hispanics in particular. And what does that mean? It's made it from a regional issue, which we saw 30 years ago, to a much more of a national issue, and this has come up in terms of Iowa politics and elsewhere, where they have their big meatpacking plants and so on to work in certain kinds of jobs. Let's turn to the micro-segregation. Here we're talking about neighborhood segregation within cities. And this is the more traditional style. This is the more fine-grained kind of segregation. And here we get a little bit different story. So we've taken a few cities that are mentioned in the report in Europe, and we tried to identify what would be a good comparison here. And we identified a few cities, and we've got more in the report itself. This comes from a typology that Audrey Singer at the Brookings Foundation has put together. And she identified these post-World War II gateways. A lot of the European cities that have experienced growth, immigrant growth, occurred in the post-World War II period. You can see Houston here. You can see the dark in this case refers to those where the census tract was a majority non-white. The orange here is 10% to 50%. And it doesn't show up here very well, but the white on the outside of this are areas that are less than 10%. These are predominantly white areas, the far reaches of the suburban areas. And you can see San Diego here. The dark line that you see encases the city limits of San Diego, the city limits of Houston. And you can see in the case of Houston, the sort of chocolate center and vanilla parts of the suburbs. That's less true in the case of San Diego, which doesn't follow this traditional or this historic pattern. This is what we see in Phoenix. Again, you see the same sort of thing. Atlanta's, these are what are the emerging gateways that have occurred over the last maybe 20 years. And you can see, again, the same sort of pattern. Phoenix is a little bit different from Atlanta, which is much more concentrated. But you can see the white suburbs. In this case, it shows up, the white suburbs way at the periphery of Atlanta. So none of this is particularly surprising. Again, to summarize this, and here we're comparing Rotterdam, London, Brussels, and Amsterdam. In the case of London and Brussels, very diverse places that have experienced lots of immigration. And you can see in this particular case, we've used different scales for each depending on the overall level of citizenship within each of these metropolitan areas. But the bottom line here, unlike what we saw for the macro segregation or the county-to-county differences, here we see much higher rates of segregation within these new immigrant gateways in the United States than what we see in Amsterdam, Brussels, London, or Rotterdam. You know, numbers roughly half. And again, you have to take these with a grain of salt because we're talking about different ways of measuring race, ethnicity, immigration. We're talking about different scales, but what we tried to do is we tried to find units that were most comparable. But there are some caveats or some cautions that need to be pay attention to when you're looking at these sorts of numbers. But in general, we see less segregation within these new immigrant destinations than what we see in the United States. Now, we haven't looked at everything. We've only looked at 4 European cities so far. This is a chart that we put together where we took different case studies of segregation for different cities in Europe and the United States, and they vary here from Birmingham, the Bangladeshis in Birmingham, and the Bangladeshis in London. Those are at the very top here. You probably can't see this, which doesn't really matter, all the way down to foreigners in Munich, Germany, Africans in Rome, and so on. And you can see where the U.S. in their largest cities tends to reside. You can see blacks are at roughly 60, Hispanics are roughly at 50, and Asians are at roughly 40. So the least segregated group are Asians. So let me talk a little bit and sum up here about lessons learned. The minority segregation, I think, throughout the Western world presents barriers to full integration and social inclusion. The United States, this is a very big issue today. The National Academy of Sciences just released in September their report on new immigration and integration in the United States, and focusing not only on how immigrants assimilate or fit into American society in a number of different dimensions, but also how from generation to generation integration or not takes hold and what the variations are. Secondly, minorities in the United States seem to be, based on the evidence that we presented so far, seem to be less spatially integrated than their immigrant counterparts in much of Europe. And the recent immigrant experiences in much of Europe seem to correspond, at least from this preliminary analysis, with the experiences of America's Asians and Hispanic groups, which are either our majority first and second generation. Black African Americans still seem to be the exceptional case in the United States. And even though there have been downward trends over the last 20 years, this has occurred in the context of still continuing massive white outmigration to the suburbs and beyond, even into rural areas. In fact, one of the things that always amazes me when you see the evidence on the spatial distribution of the population in the United States. You look at the rural population, under 2,500 population, the majority of rural people in the United States today, as officially defined by the Census Bureau, actually live in metropolitan areas. And what are those areas? Those are the open countrysides. They're very small communities. They're the exurban areas. They're really at the periphery. And we're talking about gated communities. We're talking about communities that aren't legal entities but are really housing developments and so on. It's a different kind of segregation. So what about the future? I think an important unanswered question here is whether current patterns of segregation, however we define it, will persist into the future. And of course, one thing I haven't talked about here is the question of whether these patterns, how issues of religion fit into this. I think the United States is unusually welcoming of religious diversity and so on, compared to many parts of Europe. And Muslims are one aspect of this. And of course, some of the literature now is suggesting what are the parallels between the spatial location of Muslims in parts of Europe, the outskirts of Paris and so on, with the experiences of blacks in the United States. At the same time, Doug Massey, who's one of the foremost experts on segregation in the United States, especially black-white segregation, sees this pattern of convergence over time, where segregation rates in cities in the United States have declined over time, and they're being countered by increasing levels of segregation in much of Europe. At the same time, immigration has taken hold in much of Europe. So let me conclude here, again saying that segregation is a key dimension of the stratification system, and I think more importantly than anything is that it overlaps with many other space-based inequalities such as poverty, unemployment, crime, housing quality, and overcrowding. We've dealt with some of that here today, but so segregation isn't just people preferring to live with their own kind, but it's related to housing quality, all sorts of things related to the quality of the neighborhood and the risk for crime and other sorts of things. What does this mean about policy? Again, it suggests raising issues about housing vouchers, which we do in the United States increasingly. We provide people with housing vouchers in the United States so they can go out and find in this sort of marketplace for housing. Other societies, in Europe especially, are more interested in things like mixed income housing. Obama now is talking about creating incentives for developers to create mixed income housing in suburban areas that so far have been predominantly white. We're talking about where we actually place social or public housing. We're talking about school funding formulas. We're even talking about immigration policy. We talk about the United States where we emphasize family relations, family reunification. What does that mean for how families and their friends concentrate in a particular locale? We can talk about cumulative causation here, where the families establish a benchmark or a beachhead and other family members come in. That's a segregating process as opposed to other processes where the entry into a country might be based on education or income or types of jobs and so on, which may be less highly related to segregation. And I think the last thing I just want to say is I think government efforts in Europe to promote immigration. We don't have a national immigration department in the United States. A much more of an effort to promote integration in contrast to this market-based housing market that we see in the United States, which essentially sorts people with different levels of income into different neighborhoods or different parts of the country. Thank you very much, and here's our contact, and I'll be happy to answer questions.